Evelyn stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the sign on the bathroom door. Men! Her heart pounded in her chest. Her hands, frail yet steady from years of perseverance, trembled as she reached out, hesitated, and then withdrew. Around her, residents shuffled past, some not even noticing her hesitation, others stealing glances filled with disapproval. She clenched her fists, inhaling sharply. She had spent 70 years fighting to be herself, yet here, in a place meant to provide care and dignity in her final years, she was once again being forced into an identity that was never hers. A gruff voice broke through her thoughts. "You going in or what?" A man in a hospital gown, perhaps in his 80s, eyed her with an expression that made her skin crawl. She stepped back instinctively, shaking her head. I'll wait," she murmured, forcing a polite smile. This wasn't just about a bathroom. It was about basic respect, basic dignity, things she had fought for her entire life. When she had arrived at Maplewood Assisted Living, she had been hopeful. She had imagined a quiet, peaceful existence, filled with afternoon sun on the porch, warm meals, and laughter from the few friends she had left. But what she got instead was rules that refused to recognize her existence. The administration had been clear. "We adhere to legal documentation. Your birth certificate says male. You must use the men's facilities." Evelyn had tried to reason with them. She had explained who she was, what she had been through, how forcing her into the men's room was more than just uncomfortable. It was humiliating, dangerous even. But the director, a woman with tightly pulled back gray hair and an expression as rigid as her policies, had simply shrugged. "If you don't like it," she had said, her voice void of empathy, "you are free to leave." But leaving wasn't an option. This was the only place she could afford. As Evelyn turned away from the restroom door, she felt the weight of exhaustion press upon her shoulders. How many times in her life had she been told she didn't belong? That she had to conform? That she had to erase herself just to survive? She closed her eyes, gripping the railing along the hallway. She had fought too long, too hard, to simply let this go. But she was tired. God, she was tired. Then, a voice behind her. "Mom?" Evelyn turned. Her son. And in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't expected. Shock, confusion, and anger. What do you think Evelyn should do? Should she stay and fight or leave and start over? Comment below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to support more stories like this. Evelyn froze at the sound of his voice. It had been months since her son, Michael, last visited. No. Seeing him standing there, his brows furrowed in confusion as he took in the scene. The men's restroom sign looming behind her, the tension in her shoulders, she felt an ache she had buried long ago resurface. Michael's eyes darted between her and the door. "What's going on?" His voice was cautious, as if he already knew the answer but wished he didn't. Evelyn swallowed, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing. Sweetheart, just deciding if I should go in." She gestured weakly at the door, her fingers trembling at the mere thought. Michael's expression darkened. "Mom, what the hell do you mean? This isn't right." Evelyn sighed, the weight of years of battles, of justifying her existence, pressing down on her chest. How could she explain that this wasn't new, that she had been fighting to be seen, to be accepted? For as long as she could remember, she turned away from the restroom and motioned for Michael to walk with her. "It's a long story," she murmured, leading him toward the small courtyard where the sun cast warm rays over the worn-out benches. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass, and for a moment, it almost felt peaceful. Almost. Michael sat beside her, still tense, still brimming with silent anger. "Then tell me," he said, "because I need to understand." Evelyn exhaled slowly, staring at the wrinkled hands folded in her lap. "And then," she told him, "before I was Evelyn, I was someone else." She had grown up in a time when the word transgender wasn't even in common vocabulary. In the world's eyes, she had been born a boy, but deep inside, she had known the truth. From as early as 5 or 6, she had felt it, the wrongness of it all. The way her mother would ruffle her hair and call her such a strong young man. The way her father would clap her on the back and tell her to man up. But there had been no words to explain the turmoil she felt inside. So, she had played the role they expected. She had cut her hair short, worn the stiff-collared shirts, tried to force herself into a mold that never quite fit. And for a while, it worked until puberty hit. Until she looked in the mirror one day and could no longer recognize the person staring back. I tried. Michael. I really did, but every day felt like I was dying inside. In her teenage years, she had hidden behind silence, behind books, behind a life that wasn't hers. She had prayed, God. She had prayed so hard for this feeling to go away, for something to change. And when it didn't, she had made a choice. She had confided in her mother. Mom, I think something's wrong with me. Her mother had smiled softly, running a hand through Evelyn's hair. Don't be silly. You're just confused. Every boy your age feels out of place sometimes. But it wasn't confusion. Her father had been harsher. You will not speak of this again, he had warned, his voice like thunder. So, she had buried it. She tried to live as they wanted. She got married young, trying to be the husband society expected. She had a son, Michael, and for a time, she convinced herself that maybe, just maybe, she could be happy. But the facade didn't last. The marriage crumbled under the weight of her identity, of the truth she had spent decades suppressing. By the time she finally gathered the courage to embrace herself, she had lost everything: her parents, her job, even custody of her son. Michael had resented her for years, believing she had abandoned him, believing she had been selfish. He had refused to speak to her, refused to acknowledge the name Evelyn. You weren't there, Michael had spat at her. Years later, during one of their rare conversations, you chose yourself over me. And maybe, in his eyes, she had. But Evelyn had spent her whole life choosing everyone else. And for once, she had needed to be free. Michael listened now, his hands clenched into fists, his jaw tight. I was angry, he admitted, his voice raw. I didn't understand. I still don't. Not fully, Evelyn nodded. I never expected you to. I just wanted you to know that I loved you, that I always have. Michael let out a shaky breath, rubbing his temples. He was no longer the boy who had yelled at her in frustration, who had refused to hear her side of the story. He had grown, learned, softened. And yet, seeing his mother, this woman who had fought her whole life for a sliver of peace, being reduced to this humiliation, to being forced back into a role that had nearly destroyed her, it made his blood boil. This isn't right, he murmured, more to himself than to her. Evelyn smiled sadly. It never has been. Michael exhaled, staring off into the distance, his mind clearly racing. Then, suddenly, he turned to her, his expression determined. We're fixing this, he said. Evelyn blinked. Michael, no. I should have fought for you when I was younger. I should have understood sooner. But I'm here now. He stood, jaw set, ready for a fight that had been a lifetime in the making. And Evelyn, for the first time in years, she felt something new bloom inside her chest. Hope. Michael stormed down the hallway, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Evelyn hurried behind him, her frail steps quickened by the urgency in his stride. She had seen this fire in him before, a fire that had once been aimed at her. But this time, it burned for a different reason. Michael, please, she called out softly, catching up just as he reached the front desk. The receptionist, a young woman with neat blonde hair and an expression of forced politeness, barely had time to look up before Michael slammed his palms onto the counter. I need to speak to the director. Now. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a barely contained fury that made the receptionist hesitate. I'm sorry, sir, but the director is... I don't care what she's doing, he cut in. My mother has been mistreated under this facility's so-called policies, and I want answers. Evelyn touched his arm gently, shaking her head. Michael, I've tried. They won't listen. Michael turned to her, eyes blazing. Then they're going to listen today. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. Sir, if you have a complaint, you can file it in writing and writing. Michael scoffed. My mother is forced to use the men's restroom despite her identity, despite her dignity, and you want me to file a damn complaint? Before the woman could respond, a voice rang out from the hallway. What's going on here? The director of Maplewood Assisted Living stood at the entrance to her office, arms crossed, an irritated expression on her face. Michael straightened, stepping forward, You're the director?
I am.
Good, he said, his voice sharp. Then explain to me why my mother is being humiliated in a place that claims to provide care and respect to the elderly. The director sighed, rubbing her temples as if she had heard this argument 100 times before. I understand your frustration, Mr. Thompson, but our policies are in accordance with legal documentation. Your mother's birth certificate. My mother's birth certificate is a technicality. Michael shot back. It doesn't define her. And you know that. The director's lips thinned. We have to maintain structure in this facility. Mr. Thompson, some of our residents are uncomfortable with... Michael let out a bitter laugh. With what? Letting an old woman pee in peace? Evelyn flinched at the harshness of his words, but deep down, she knew he was right. The director's face hardened. This isn't about cruelty. It's about policy. Michael's jaw tightened. Policy is supposed to protect people, not strip them of their dignity. The room was silent for a moment. Tension thickened the air. The receptionist shifted awkwardly. Evelyn looked down, feeling the weight of decades of this same battle pressing on her chest. Michael turned to her. Mom, do you want to stay here? Evelyn hesitated. She couldn't afford to leave, but staying meant enduring this injustice every day. I don't want to cause trouble, she whispered. Michael exhaled sharply. You're not causing trouble. Mom, they are. He turned back to the director. We're not leaving this office until you do something about this. The director's expression remained cold, unyielding. That's your choice, Mr. Thompson. But our policy stands. Michael's hands curled into fists, his body vibrating with anger. Then I'll make sure the world knows exactly what kind of place you're running here. The director's gaze flickered. Just for a second. Excuse me? You heard me? Michael said. This isn't just about my mother. This is about every elderly trans person who is forced back into a life they fought so hard to escape. If you think I'm going to let my mother suffer quietly, you're mistaken. Evelyn placed a hand on his arm again, this time not to stop him, but to steady him. She had never seen him fight for her like this before. Not like this. The director studied him for a moment, then let out a long sigh. I will bring this to the board for review. Michael narrowed his eyes. When? She pressed her lips together. Next week. Michael scoffed. No, now. The director stiffened. That's not how this works. Then I'll make sure we do things my way, Michael said. The fire in his voice was undeniable. And for the first time, Evelyn wondered if, just maybe, this time would be different. Struggle? Michael paced back and forth in Evelyn's small room, his jaw clenched, hands raking through his hair. The confrontation with the director had ended in nothing but empty promises, just another bureaucratic delay, another way for them to sweep the problem under the rug. Evelyn sat quietly in her armchair by the window, her frail fingers tracing the edge of her teacup. Outside, the late afternoon sun bathed the garden in a golden glow, but all she felt was a deep, sinking exhaustion. I can't believe this, Michael muttered. It's the 21st century. Mom, and you're still being treated like this? Evelyn let out a soft sigh. It's nothing new, sweetheart. Michael stopped pacing, turning to her. But it should be. He crouched in front of her, taking her hands in his. They were cold, delicate, worn with age and experience. Mom, we can't let them do this to you. You don't deserve this. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking, her voice softer than before. Then what's the alternative? Michael inhaled deeply. He knew where this conversation was going, and he already hated it. We take you out of here. Evelyn closed her eyes briefly, shaking her head. Michael. No, yes. He squeezed her hands. Mom, I make good money. I can get you into another facility, somewhere that respects you, or you can come stay with me. Whatever it takes. We'll figure it out. Evelyn looked away, her gaze distant. It's not that simple. Yes. It is, Michael insisted. You don't have to stay here. You don't have to endure this. Her fingers tightened around his. And then what? You put your life on hold to take care of me? You stretch yourself thin paying for a place I can barely afford? She shook her head. I won't do that to you. Michael's throat tightened. Mom, I can handle it. Evelyn's expression was pained. That's what your father always said. Too. Michael stiffened. His father, The man who had married Evelyn before she transitioned. The man who had once loved her but could never accept her truth had been a man of duty, sacrificing everything for others until he had nothing left. Evelyn's voice was gentle but firm. "I won't be a burden to you, Michael." "You're not a burden," he said, his voice cracking. "You're my mother." A heavy silence filled the room. Evelyn turned to the window, watching the other residents shuffle along the garden path below. "Leaving means giving up my independence. If I go with you, I lose that. If I go to another home, what if it's the same?" Michael exhaled sharply. "So what? You just stay here and let them treat you like this?" She smiled weakly. "I've spent my whole life fighting. Michael, sometimes I just want to rest." Michael's hands curled into fists. He hated this. Hated that she was so used to this kind of treatment that she considered it an inevitability. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down. Yelling wouldn't fix this. Anger wouldn't change anything. Instead, he softened. "Mom, I know you're tired, but this isn't about just you. It's about every person who comes after you. What if there's another woman like you who ends up here? What if she doesn't have someone to fight for her?" Evelyn blinked, her lips parting slightly. That thought hadn't occurred to her. Michael leaned in. "You always told me to stand up for what's right. Well, now I'm asking you to do the same, not just for yourself, but for the people who will come after." Evelyn's chest rose and fell as she considered his words. "Mom," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't want you to suffer in silence anymore. I can't stand by and watch that." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the small clock on the bedside table. Finally, Evelyn exhaled. "I don't know what the right choice is," she admitted. Michael nodded. "Then let's make one together." Michael sat in the dimly lit common room of Maplewood Assisted Living, his legs bouncing anxiously as he scrolled through his phone. He had spent the past 2 days gathering information, reading about trans rights in elder care facilities, searching for legal precedents, and contacting advocacy groups. If the director thought she could dismiss Evelyn's rights as a mere policy issue, she was dead wrong. Evelyn, on the other hand, sat across from him, quiet and contemplative. She could see the determination in her son's eyes, but she also knew that this fight was bigger than just the two of them. "I don't want you to do something reckless," she warned gently. Michael looked up at her, his jaw tight. "Mom, what they're doing to you is wrong. And if you won't fight for yourself, I will." Just as Evelyn opened her mouth to respond, a voice rang out from behind them. "You again." They turned to see the director, standing in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. Her usual tight bun was perfectly in place, and her expression was unreadable, somewhere between annoyance and forced patience. Michael stood up immediately. "Yeah, me again." The director sighed. "Mr. Thompson, I understand your concerns, but as I told you before, no." Michael cut in, his voice sharp. "You don't understand. Because if you did, we wouldn't be having this conversation again." Evelyn watched as the two stared each other down, neither willing to back down first. The director exhaled through her nose, like she was speaking to a particularly stubborn child. "I already told you that this is a policy set by—" "I read the policy," Michael interrupted. "I also read the laws. And you know what? Your policy is outdated. Illegal? Even." That caught the director off guard. She blinked, just for a second. "Excuse me?" Michael took a step closer. "Federal and state regulations prohibit discrimination against transgender individuals in federally funded institutions. That includes elder care facilities like this one." He pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. This is a case from last year where a nursing home was sued for exactly what you're doing to my mother." The room fell silent. Evelyn watched as the director's confidence wavered, her lips pressing into a thin line. Michael continued, his voice unwavering. "If you force my mother to keep using the men's restroom, you're opening this facility up to a massive lawsuit. And I promise you, I won't stop until I make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of place you're running." The director's expression darkened. "Are you threatening me?" Michael's lips curled into a cold smile. "No, I'm promising you." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "Mr. Thompson, I have a facility to run. I can't cater to individual—" "This isn't about catering to anyone," Michael snapped. "It's about basic human dignity. Evelyn had never seen him like this before. For so many years, she had felt like a burden, like she was fighting alone. But now, for the first time, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. The director sighed, rubbing her temple. Even if I wanted to make accommodations, we would need approval from... Michael took another step forward. Then get it. Because I'm not leaving this time. The director glanced at Evelyn, as if hoping for her to step in and calm things down. But Evelyn simply met her gaze, her shoulders no longer hunched in defeat. I think my son has made our position clear, she said quietly. The director pursed her lips. No, Michael cut in. No more I'll look into it. No more I'll bring it up to the board. I want an answer. Now. The tension in the room was suffocating. For the first time, the director looked unsure. Michael could feel it. He had her cornered. After a long pause, she finally sighed, her composure cracking just a little. Fine. I will authorize a gender-neutral restroom, but that's the best I can do. Evelyn's breath hitched. A victory. Small, but real. Michael, however, wasn't finished. And you'll ensure no other resident goes through what my mother did? The director exhaled sharply. We will revise our policy. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even close to the justice Evelyn deserved. But it was a start. Michael stared at the director, his jaw tight, then finally nodded. Good. Because if you go back on your word, I'll make sure you regret it. The director, clearly exhausted with the fight, simply turned and walked away. Michael turned to his mother, his chest still rising and falling from the adrenaline pumping through his veins. Evelyn just looked at him with tears in her eyes. You really would have fought them to the end, wouldn't you? She murmured. Michael smiled softly. Of course, because you fought your whole life. Mom, and you shouldn't have to fight alone anymore. She squeezed his hand. Thank you, sweetheart. Michael exhaled, his rage finally settling into relief. This wasn't the end. There were still battles to fight. But for today, they had won. Evelyn sat on the worn-out couch in the common room, staring at the cup of tea in her hands. The warmth seeped into her skin, but she still felt cold. The confrontation with the director had ended with a small victory. A gender-neutral restroom would be installed. But she knew how these things worked. Promises like that could take weeks, months, maybe even never to materialize. Michael had left earlier that day, still fired up, still ready to fight. But Evelyn, she just felt tired. She had spent her whole life battling for something as simple as existing. And now, in what was supposed to be her final years of peace, she found herself once again at war. Evelyn, a gentle voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned and saw Margaret, one of the senior nurses at Maplewood Assisted Living. She was in her late 50s, kind-eyed, her graying brown hair pulled into a loose bun. Mind if I sit? Evelyn gestured toward the empty spot beside her. Of course. Margaret settled in, her uniform slightly wrinkled from a long shift. She studied Evelyn for a moment before speaking. I heard about what happened with the director. Evelyn let out a soft, humorless chuckle. Let me guess. Everyone thinks I'm just causing trouble? Margaret shook her head. Not everyone. Evelyn blinked. Margaret hesitated, then lowered her voice. I wanted to say that I admire you. Evelyn frowned. Admire me? For standing up for yourself, Margaret clarified. For pushing back. A lot of people here, they don't know how to fight for themselves, or they're too afraid to. Evelyn's lips pressed together. I wasn't trying to start a war. I know, Margaret said gently. But sometimes, war finds us anyway. There was a long silence between them. Then, Margaret sighed. I shouldn't be telling you this, but I know of other residents who have been treated unfairly. Just like you. Evelyn turned to her sharply. What do you mean? Margaret hesitated, then leaned in slightly. This isn't the first time Maplewood has been called out for discrimination. And it's not just trans residents. It's anyone who doesn't fit into their idea of normal. Evelyn felt a slow anger creep up her spine. Like who? Margaret hesitated, then whispered. There was a man, a few years ago, who had dementia. His partner, his husband, would visit him every day, but the administration refused to let them share a room. They didn't see them as real family. Evelyn felt sick. Margaret continued. His husband fought, just like your son did. He tried everything. But in the end, The man passed away alone in his separate room. Evelyn clenched her jaw, her hands tightening around her cup. Margaret sighed. The administration always finds loopholes. Excuses, ways to keep things the way they want. They know most residents won't fight back, or can't. Evelyn looked down at her hands. She knew what it felt like to be erased. And now, she realized she wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for all of them. "I don't have much power," Margaret admitted. "But if there's something I can do, I want to help." Evelyn turned to her, searching her face for sincerity. She found it. "You'd risk your job for this?" Evelyn asked quietly. Margaret smiled sadly. "I've been a nurse for 30 years. Evelyn, I took this job to care for people, not to watch them suffer under outdated policies. If I lose my job for standing up for what's right, then maybe I don't want to work here anyway." For the first time in days, Evelyn felt hope bloom in her chest. She reached out and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Thank you," Margaret squeezed back. "You're not alone in this fight. Evelyn, you never were." As the weight of that realization settled over her, Evelyn straightened her spine for the first time in years. She wasn't just a woman in a nursing home being pushed around. She was a fighter, a survivor, a voice for those who had none. And she wasn't done yet. Evelyn sat at the edge of her bed that night, staring at the dim glow of the bedside lamp. Her conversation with Margaret had left her shaken, not just because of what she had learned, but because of what it meant. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the man who had died alone because the home refused to recognize his husband. It was about the other residents, the ones too afraid or too weak to speak up, the ones who had spent their entire lives fighting just to end up erased in the place that was supposed to care for them. She had spent decades fighting for the right to be seen. And now, even in the final years of her life, she realized something. She still had one more fight left in her. The next morning, Evelyn sat in the common area, waiting. Michael had promised he'd be there soon, but there was someone else she needed to talk to first. And right on time, Margaret arrived, but she wasn't alone. Behind her was another resident, a frail old man with soft white hair and tired blue eyes. His hands trembled slightly as he walked, but there was determination in his steps. Margaret introduced him softly. "Evelyn, this is Harold." He knew the man I told you about. Harold sat down carefully across from her, his eyes flickering with emotions that time had not erased. "I heard what you're trying to do," he said, his voice thin but steady, "and I think it's about time someone did." Evelyn leaned forward. "You knew the man they forced away from his husband?" Harold nodded, looking away. "His name was Robert. He was my friend, and he died in a room alone, calling for the man he loved. I watched it happen." His voice broke. "I couldn't do anything." A deep ache filled Evelyn's chest. Margaret placed a gentle hand on Harold's shoulder. "We can't change what happened to Robert, but we can make sure it doesn't happen again." Harold nodded slowly, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "Tell me what to do." Evelyn inhaled. This was it. The moment where silence was no longer an option. "We make them listen," she said. That afternoon, Michael arrived, walking through the doors with a fire still burning in his eyes. But what he didn't expect to see was his mother standing in the middle of the common room, surrounded by a small group of residents and staff. Margaret was there. Harold was there. Other residents, some in wheelchairs, some holding onto walkers, some barely able to stand but refusing to sit down, were there. Even a few staff members stood at the edges, watching. Evelyn stood in front of them all, her back straight, her voice clear. "This place was supposed to be a home," she began. "A place where people could grow old with dignity, but dignity is the one thing we've been denied." Murmurs spread through the room. A few nurses exchanged glances. Michael stepped closer, watching in awe as his mother did something she had spent her entire life doing, standing up for herself. She wasn't alone this time. Margaret stepped forward. "For too long, people have been ignored here. People like Evelyn. People like Robert." Her voice cracked slightly. "I knew Robert. I saw what happened to him, and I will never forget it." A heavy silence settled over the room. Then Harold spoke, his voice shaking but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I held Robert's hand before he died," he said. "I told him his husband was coming. I lied." He swallowed hard. "I had to lie to a dying man because this place took his love away from him." A few gasps, a few sharp inhales. Even the staff members who had stayed silent all these years looked shaken. Michael felt his heart twist in his chest. He had come here to fight for his mother, but he hadn't realized. This was bigger than just her. This was about everyone in this room. Evelyn stepped forward.
We are not asking for special treatment.
We are not asking for favors. We are asking for what every human being deserves, to be treated with respect, to be recognized for who we are, and to be given the right to exist without shame. Then she turned to the one person she knew had been watching from the doorway. The director. She stood there, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Are you going to keep looking the other way? Evelyn asked, her voice steady. Or are you finally going to listen? A long, unbearable silence filled the room. The director's jaw tightened. Her fingers tapped against her arm. Then she spoke. We will hold a meeting, she said stiffly. Tomorrow. I will discuss this with the board. But Evelyn shook her head. No more waiting. No more delays. We have waited long enough. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the residence. Michael stepped forward, his presence solid and unwavering. If this doesn't change, we will go public. We will contact the media. We will contact lawyers. This facility will have a lawsuit so big, you'll be forced to change anyway. The director's expression faltered, just slightly. She looked at Evelyn, then at Harold, then at the staff around her, and finally, she sighed. We will review all policies immediately. It took weeks. It took effort. It took every ounce of fight Evelyn had left in her. But in the end, it happened. New policies were put in place. A gender-neutral restroom was officially designated. Residents were allowed to choose their room arrangements based on identity, not outdated rules. And perhaps the most surprising thing? The director resigned. Some said it was the pressure. Some said it was guilt. Some said it was because she finally saw what she had ignored for so long. Evelyn didn't know. And honestly, she didn't care. Because in the end, love won. Not just the kind of love that exists between two people, but the kind that exists in humanity itself. The love that says, you deserve to be seen. As Evelyn sat in the garden one evening, watching the sun set, Michael sat beside her. You did it, he said softly. She smiled. We did it, Michael exhaled, shaking his head. I'm so proud of you. Mom, she looked at him, her eyes full of warmth. And I'm proud of you, too, sweetheart. A comfortable silence passed between them. Then Evelyn chuckled. Now, what do you say we take on the rest of the world? Michael laughed. I think you've earned a break first. She sipped her tea. Maybe, but not too long. Someone's got to keep fighting. Michael smiled. Then I guess we keep fighting. Together, and as the last rays of the sun bathed them in gold, Evelyn felt something she hadn't in years. Peace. A month had passed since Maplewood Assisted Living changed its policies. The new gender-neutral restroom had been installed. Residents were now given the right to choose their room arrangements based on their identity. Staff received mandatory inclusivity training, ensuring that what happened to Evelyn would never happen again. And though the changes were slow, they were real. Evelyn sat in the garden, the soft evening breeze brushing against her skin. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and the sky was painted in hues of orange and pink. She let out a deep, steady breath, one that felt lighter than any breath she had taken in years. Michael sat beside her, leaning back against the bench, a satisfied smirk on his face. You're a troublemaker. You know that? Evelyn chuckled. I like to think of it as necessary persistence. Michael grinned, shaking his head. I still can't believe it. I knew we had a strong case, but to actually see everything change, he let out a deep sigh. It feels surreal. Evelyn smiled, but there was something deeper in her expression, an understanding that change never comes easy. They never change until someone makes them, she said softly. Michael looked over at her, his gaze thoughtful. And that someone was you. She glanced at him with amusement. I seem to recall you playing a very important role in all of this. He laughed. Yeah, well, you started it, and you didn't back down, even when it got hard. Evelyn looked down at her hands that had once been forced to conform to an identity that never felt like hers. Hands that had signed legal documents with a name she had abandoned decades ago. Hands that had shaken from fear, clenched from anger, and now rested in peace. It's funny, she murmured. I thought that by now, I would have been done fighting. I thought I'd be too tired. Michael tilted his head. And? She smiled. Turns out, there's always something worth fighting for. The sound of footsteps interrupted them, and they turned to see Harold approaching with Margaret by his side. Harold's hands were still shaky, but he walked with a newfound confidence. Margaret smiled.
I have some good news.
Evelyn raised an eyebrow. Oh? Margaret glanced at Harold, nodding for him to speak. Harold cleared his throat, his voice softer than before. There's a new resident moving in tomorrow. She's transgender, like you. I was talking to her son today. He was worried, scared that she'd have to hide herself. And I told him, Harold smiled. I told him she'd be safe here. Evelyn felt her throat tighten, her chest swell with something deep and profound. Safe. A word she had spent a lifetime chasing. A word she never thought she'd hear spoken about a place like this. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. See? Mom. It mattered. Evelyn swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. It mattered. Harold chuckled. You didn't just fight for yourself. You fought for all of us, Margaret added. And because of you, this place isn't just a nursing home anymore. It's a home. Evelyn exhaled slowly, feeling years of fear, of anger, of exhaustion finally settle into something softer, something called peace. She looked at Michael. You asked me once if I wanted to stay here. Michael nodded. And now? She smiled. Now. I think I finally do. He grinned. Then that's all that matters. The four of them sat together in the fading sunlight, the garden buzzing with the sound of wind and laughter from residents enjoying their evening. This was how change began, with one person, one voice, one refusal to back down. And sometimes, that was all it took. What did this story mean to you? Do you believe one person can truly make a difference? Let us know in the comments. If you believe in standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.